Coming up, CNN didn't apologize. CNN didn't acknowledge that their original story was an embarrassment to the profession of journalism. But they did correct it, admittedly without calling it a correction. Their exact statement was, quote, "This story has been updated to include Pentagon reaction and recent developments in the Western Pacific," close quote. Translation? Our original story was an embarrassing regurgitation of Chinese Communist government propaganda, and you called us on it, so we fixed it. I would have preferred they provide the translation, but hey, it was still progress. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Let's talk for a moment about what's happening to the economy and why. Arguably, the best economy we've had, perhaps in history, is being destroyed day by restrictions imposed in virtually every state in the nation, which have now prompted widespread protests pushing for reopening of the economy. The reaction of much of the media to that push has been to mock the protesters and criticize proposals to reopen as trading dollars for lives. Let's talk about why that criticism is so unjustified. The restrictions were sold to the American public based on the assertion that COVID-19 threatened to overwhelm the American healthcare system, and the push for them ramped up largely after the unexpected scale of the impact in Italy was observed. I remember that's when I really started to clamp down on activities in which I and my family engaged. That was when I realized there was no way we were going to go visit anyone other than online. There was no way we were going to take any trips other than to the grocery store. It happened when I saw the graph showing the mountain of a rise in predicted coronavirus hospitalizations, surpassing by a massive amount the available levels of intensive care beds and ventilators in American hospitals. I envisioned people stricken by COVID-19 being led into tents in parking lots and fields in the heat of South Florida where I live, like something out of the movie Outbreak or one of the other Hollywood pandemic films. And I knew we had to avoid that, so I was on board with the restrictions. I'm confident I wasn't alone in my reaction. It was those graphs and that pitch that we needed to implement the severe restrictions and nearly shut down the economy to avoid outstripping our medical resources that sold me and millions of others. Whether because of the lockdown of the economy and the other social distancing measures, or because the estimates were dramatic overestimates, our medical resources have not been outstripped. In fact, we haven't even come close. Remember when articles ran claiming that New York State needed 40,000 ventilators? Do you remember when New York Governor Andrew Cuomo claimed at a press briefing on March 24 that he needed at least 30,000 ventilators and objected to FEMA advising they were sending 400? Cuomo vented, quote, 400 ventilators? I need 30,000 ventilators, close quote. And he went further, quote, you want a pat on the back for sending 400 ventilators? You're missing the magnitude of the problem, close quote. After those claims that New York would need 30,000 or 40,000 ventilators, President Trump disputed that and was roundly criticized for doing so. On March 27, he said, quote, I have a feeling that a lot of the numbers that are being said in some areas are just bigger than they're going to be, close quote. Referring to New York, he said, quote, I don't believe you need 40,000 or 30,000 ventilators, close quote. In the end, President Trump was right. Andrew Cuomo didn't get anything close to 30,000 ventilators, but he had more than enough because he ended up giving them away to other states, including Michigan, Maryland, and New Jersey. And that's the way it's been across the country. The massive number of ventilators and intensive care beds that were expected to be needed just didn't pan out. There is no way that the country would have stood for shutting down the economy based on the numbers we're seeing now. Yes, they're bad, but nowhere near the millions that some in the media pitched, and nowhere near the roughly 250,000 that the most prominent model projected, and now they're not expected to be as bad as the severe flu season we experienced from the fall of 2017 through May of 2018. And we never would have even considered, never would have even taken seriously a proposal to shut down the economy, to close all non-essential businesses based on a very severe year of the ordinary flu. And that's the level of mortality that we're looking at now. And I'm talking about total deaths, not mortality rates. Because when you look at mortality rates, COVID-19 is looking more and more like the ordinary flu. It's looking more and more like this coronavirus is much more virulent than we expected, much more contagious. But as you look at those higher and higher numbers of people who were shown to have actually been infected, most of whom did not exhibit symptoms, as shown in studies of antibody presence out of California and New York and elsewhere, and then compare them to the number of deaths experienced, you realize that the mortality rate of COVID-19 is looking like a maximum of 0.5% and potentially much lower than that. The mortality rate that was pitched by the World Health Organization was 3.4%. The mortality rate we were initially looking at in places like Italy was well above that. At one point, the media was pushing the idea that the mortality rate could be 10%. All of that talk, all of those projections from the experts helped to sell us the idea that virtually shutting down the economy was the best thing to do. We looked at those numbers, we looked at those death rates, we looked at the potential to overwhelm the healthcare system. We looked at the expected number of deaths, we looked at all of that in determining that virtually shutting down the economy made sense. But now, as we've experienced far less of a burden on the healthcare system than expected, perhaps in significant part because of the steps we've taken, and we've experienced a dramatically lower mortality rate than expected, many in the media and politicians, primarily on the left, and people you just talk to about the issue are objecting to opening up the economy based on a belief that more people will die if you do. They claim that those who want to open up the economy are trading money for lives. But wasn't that part of the evaluation to begin with? If you had a bad flu season coming and you figured you could save lives by shutting down the economy, closing the beaches, closing all but essential businesses, allowing use of restaurants only for pickup and not for eat-in, closing the amusement parks, closing the movie theaters, and allowing only telecommuting, no in-office work except for essential businesses. But as an elected official, you chose not to support doing all of that because, hey, it's just a bad flu season, even though bad flu seasons involve the deaths of tens of thousands of individuals, the worst recent year causing 80,000 deaths in the U.S. alone. In that instance, based on the logic of the media and much of the left, you'd be trading dollars for lives. And that happens every flu season. We don't shut down. Think of it another way, and you'll realize that elected officials trade dollars for lives all the time, and it doesn't even have to involve communicable diseases. Every year, approximately 40,000 people die from traffic accidents, whether passengers or drivers in the vehicles or pedestrians hit by vehicles. About 40,000 people die every year. Would anybody deny that if we had a speed limit on all roadways of 15 miles per hour, nobody or almost nobody would die in a traffic accident? It takes barely more than a tap on the brakes to stop a modern car going only 15 miles per hour. There's virtually no pedestrian that couldn't get out of the way of a vehicle traveling only 15 miles per hour. That's why most school zone speed limits are 15 miles per hour. So why don't we have a 15-mile-per-hour speed limit on every road in America? Because it would destroy the economy and make everybody miserable. You couldn't get to work on time. That house in the suburbs you spent years paying for would be worthless. Virtually nobody would take a road trip because nobody would have enough time. Most hotels, amusement parks, zoos, stadiums, and arenas would go out of business. The real estate market outside of urban cores would collapse. And people would be stuck in their houses because the time commitment to leave their houses to travel would be excessive. People would be miserable, but it would save about 40,000 lives every year. And we don't do it. Every year we could, and every year we don't. Because elected officials routinely trade lives for money. 40,000 lives a year, even 40,000 lives every single year, is not enough reason to destroy the economy. Don't take my word for it. Take the actions, or rather inaction, of elected officials for it. They've made that calculation, and they continue to make it every year. That's why we can legally drive 65 miles an hour or more on most sections of interstates, and 45 miles an hour or more on most side roads. And any journalist, commentator, politician, or other person who tells you that we don't make that calculation every year in America is either refusing to tell the truth or hasn't really thought about it. Next topic. CNN runs propaganda for the Chinese People's Liberation Army, Navy. Did you see the article that CNN ran on April 13 entitled, "China's Navy is Controlling Coronavirus and Aircraft Carriers Deployment Proves It," report says. CNN literally ran Chinese People's Liberation Army, Navy, propaganda, which they obtained from a Chinese state-run tabloid. The bulk of the article was the contents of the propaganda report, with a minimal reference to the U.S. military saying that it had retained its capabilities. It was propaganda masquerading as journalism by pretending to be a news story about the contents of the propaganda report. Nothing from CNN surprises me these days, but this one story really disturbs me. We need to keep an eye on this. When the media plays these games, doing the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party by publishing such propaganda, we need to call them on it. As I've said before, the news media is critical to the success of any democracy, constitutional republic, or other representative government, provided they actually do their jobs. Acting as a propaganda tool for a brutal communist regime is not doing their jobs. I'm happy to report that CNN did receive quite a bit of pushback from elected officials, from an editorial contributor to the Washington Post, from Tucker Carlson on Fox News, and although admittedly probably not having quite the same impact, from me on Twitter. And I'm even happier to report that CNN changed the article. The title is now, "Chinese State Media Claims Country's Navy is Not Affected by Coronavirus." The article has now been fleshed out, so it's no longer simply a story regurgitating Chinese Communist military propaganda, and instead contains more analysis and additional input from the U.S. military, explaining how China can cover up COVID-19 outbreaks on their ships because they're generally simply patrolling close to Chinese shores and can quickly offload infected sailors in nearby Chinese ports. The article now contains the following statement regarding the virus. Quote, "Yet according to the Chinese government, not a single serving member of the country's military has been infected." Close quote. I would have preferred an even more overt journalistic equivalent to the crowd chanting bullshit at a football game, but I'll take it. CNN didn't apologize. CNN didn't acknowledge that their original story was an embarrassment to the profession of journalism. But they did correct it, admittedly without calling it a correction. Their exact statement was, quote, "This story has been updated to include Pentagon reaction and recent developments in the Western Pacific," close quote. Translation: our original story was an embarrassing regurgitation of Chinese Communist government propaganda, and you called us on it, so we fixed it. I would have preferred they provide the translation, but hey, it was still progress. Next topic. College students are being secretly censored. In the world of social media censorship, nothing should surprise me, but I have to admit I was surprised when I recently read an article at the website thefire.org. FIRE stands for Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, an organization that's done a great job defending free speech, due process, freedom of association, religious liberty, and other rights of students and faculty members at colleges across the country. The article in question appeared on April 22nd and was entitled, Survey: 77% of colleges use secret social media blacklist to censor the public in violation of First Amendment. Among the revelations in the article was that over 1,800 unique terms are blocked on various college social media pages, and that, quote, secret filters automatically remove comments mentioning political figures, corporate partners, sports teams, faculty members, and even an emoji, close quote. The findings of the survey conducted by FIRE confirm that public universities are censoring public dialogue. As the author of the report, Adam Steinbaugh, notes, quote, there's no social media exception to the First Amendment. Government actors cannot sanitize public discourse, whether it's President Trump blocking Twitter critics or American colleges filtering dissent on their social media accounts. By selectively eliminating particular viewpoints, universities are violating the First Amendment, close quote. Some of the university's specific findings are really eye-opening. For example, the University of Kentucky blocks the words birds, chickens, and filthy. As the author notes, that's probably an attempt to censor criticism of Aramark, the food service vendor to the university. Universities including Portland State, Oklahoma State, University of Arizona, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill block the names of political candidates, including Trump, Bernie, and Hillary. Some of the censorship even focuses on competitive sports and may seem like nothing to worry about, but the bottom line is it's still censorship. And regardless of which team you support, Texas A&M should not be blocking references to the hook 'em horn gesture of the University of Texas. And Oklahoma State University shouldn't be blocking references to Boomer Sooner, the University of Oklahoma fight song. Apparently, in fear of reaction to criticism by PETA over research conducted on dogs, Texas A&M blocks the terms PETA and abuse. In a similar vein, Santa Monica College prohibited the terms cats, dissecting, torture, and killing after PETA opposed cat dissections in a class. This one might bring back memories. Clemson University blocked the mention of Harambe, the gorilla who became famous in a barrage of internet memes a few years ago. Lest you think that these public colleges are acting nobly and not trying to cover their butts, there is the policy of Suffolk County Community College, which blocks the words apologize, resign, and disgrace. Think that might be trying to censor criticism of the college administration? I don't know how you could reach any other conclusion. How are these colleges taking these actions? They're working with Facebook, using automated content filters that hide comments that use the words they don't like. So for all of you who routinely reference the fact that Facebook is a company, not a government entity, to explain why its actions don't constitute censorship in violation of the First Amendment, get a load of what's happening here. Public colleges, entities which are clearly subject to the First Amendment, are working with Facebook to ensure that those who comment on their social media are censored. Lest you think my criticism of this censorship comes only from my right-leaning beliefs, I'm opposed to the following restrictions as well. The University of Kansas censors references to boycott Koch Industries, And Georgia State University locked out a Twitter account of Georgia for Bernie. And finally, Mississippi State University has blocked out legalize marijuana in Mississippi. All of those actions are unacceptable. This has to stop. Not only is the censorship occurring, but it's being done in secret, and that makes it that much worse. If public universities don't want to see speech which they don't like, then they need to make sure they don't participate in social media forums. If the cost to them of locking themselves out of social media is too high, then they need to accept that they are participants in a public opinion marketplace, and the price of admission to that marketplace is speech that sometimes makes you uncomfortable. After all, given that these institutions are supposed to be educating our children, to be making them more productive adults in our society, the universities themselves should be big boys and girls and understand that not everything people say will be nice, and not everyone will like them. That's life, even in the ivory towers on campus. Hopefully, you'll continue to like and listen to this podcast from your cars, your homes, and even your ivory towers if you have them. I'll be back next week with another episode for your enjoyment. Be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube also, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.